Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
James was never the type who liked business trips. To him, they were just a dull obligation, endless meetings, repetitive speeches, and that formal atmosphere that made him uncomfortable. But ironically, it was on one of those trips that everything changed. During a break at the event he was attending, he stepped out to grab a coffee. The hall was packed, and voices blended into a muffled buzz. That's when he heard a different kind of laugh. It wasn't loud or over the top, but it had this captivating sound, almost like a melody standing out in the crowd. He looked around and saw a woman sitting alone at one of the tables, holding a cup of tea and reading a book. There was something about her that made him stop. Maybe it was her focused gaze, the calm way she flipped the pages, or her relaxed posture, as if she were in a completely different universe than the formal setting around her. James usually didn't strike up conversations with strangers, but for some reason, he felt like walking over. "That book looks more interesting than the event," he commented, trying to sound casual. The woman looked up and gave a slight smile, gentle but full of charm. "Oh, no doubt. Some stories are way more exciting than corporate speeches." James laughed, and suddenly the conversation just flowed. Her name was Annika. She was from Germany, spoke with a light accent, which made her voice even more captivating. She wasn't there out of obligation, but by choice. She worked as a translator and loved discovering new cultures, learning new languages, traveling to unfamiliar places. There was something inspiring in the way she talked about the world, as if every experience was a new page in a book she was writing. Throughout the day, every time they bumped into each other in the hallways, they exchanged glances and brief comments, like they'd known each other for ages. When night fell, instead of going with his coworkers to a formal dinner, James decided to do something different. "What if we forget this event for a few hours?" he suggested, a bit awkwardly. Annika raised an eyebrow, amused. "And what do you suggest?" "Just talking, no schedules, no rules." She thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "That sounds a lot more interesting than any lecture." They spent hours talking, laughing, sharing stories about their lives. James, who always considered himself a practical man with little patience for discussing feelings, found himself talking about his childhood, his ambitions, even his fears. Annika, on the other hand, seemed fascinated by every detail, as if she were discovering a new, intriguing character in one of her books. Time went by too fast, and before they realized, it was already past midnight. But neither of them wanted that night to end. James felt something he'd never felt before. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper. As if, in some inexplicable way, Annika had walked into his life to fill a space he didn't even know existed. In the following days, whenever they had a free moment, they were together. James began to notice that, with her, everything felt lighter, simpler. Every conversation was a discovery, every shared look seemed to hide something neither of them could explain. But like any trip, that encounter had an expiration date. On the last day of the event, while packing his bags, James felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't want it to end there. When they met to say goodbye, he gathered his courage and asked, "Do you think this could work?" Annika smiled and, without hesitating, answered, "I think it'd be a huge loss if we didn't try." And that's how it all began. What seemed like just a passing encounter quickly turned into something much bigger. Within a few months, James knew he didn't want a long-distance relationship. He wanted Annika by his side every day. That's when he decided, without fear, to make the proposal that would change their lives forever. The first few months of marriage felt like a dream. James and Annika, despite living modestly, were happy. Their small house felt huge when they were together. Any meal, no matter how simple, became special. They laughed at silly things, tried out new recipes, and spent hours talking about the future. But routine has a subtle way of shifting things. And that's exactly how it all started, subtly. At first, the idea of Annika giving private German lessons seemed perfect. She'd always been passionate about languages and was naturally gifted at teaching. Plus, the extra money helped a lot. Since James worked at the bank and didn't earn much, Annika's income provided some financial relief. He felt proud watching his wife build up her own student base and expand her small business. In the beginning, she taught a few times a week, always at predictable hours. Annika would host students in their home or visit them, depending on what was needed. But over time, things started to change. Suddenly, her schedule was packed. She left earlier and came back later. "Your students are wearing you out," James remarked one evening, seeing Annika collapse onto the couch, clearly exhausted. "Yeah. But the more I work, the more I earn. Can't complain," she said, smiling but looking away. James didn't push it, but something began to bother him. Annika had always been dedicated, but now she seemed to be overdoing it. Before, she'd make time to cook, watch movies together, or just sit and talk. Now, her schedule was unpredictable. What intrigued him most was the lack of detail. Whenever he asked about her students, she gave vague answers. "Who was your student today?" "Oh, a business guy who wants to learn for business trips." "And the other one?" "A young woman who wants to study in Germany." Her answers were always generic, like she was avoiding going into detail. James tried to push aside his suspicions, telling himself he was just being paranoid. But little by little, doubt started to grow. Another thing made him uncomfortable. Annika started changing clothes before leaving for her lessons. At first, it seemed normal, but then he noticed she spent more time getting ready: perfume, makeup, elegant dresses. It didn't make sense for someone who'd be spending hours teaching grammar and vocabulary. One night, while waiting for her, he noticed it was already after 10. He tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. Half an hour later, she walked in. "Hey, honey," she said, dropping her bag on the table. James crossed his arms. "You got home late. Your lesson ran long." "Yeah," she answered quickly. "My student was having trouble with pronunciation, so I had to extend the session." She smiled and went straight to the bedroom, but something about the way she acted really bugged him. She answered too quickly, without hesitation, like she'd rehearsed it. That night, while Annika slept soundly beside him, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He tried to chase the thoughts away, but it was like an itch he couldn't ignore. The next day, something happened that made his suspicions grow even stronger. During his break at the bank, he was in the break room when he overheard two customers talking in the waiting line. "Did you hear about that German teacher? They say she charges a fortune because, at the end of the lessons, she offers something a bit extra." The other man chuckled. "Seriously? People actually pay big money for that?" James, who'd been half listening, suddenly tensed up. It felt like his blood turned cold. He wanted to laugh it off, to ignore it completely, but a strange feeling took hold of him. The worst part was, deep down, he already knew this wasn't just paranoia. He just didn't want to admit it. James felt a chill run down his spine. The words he'd overheard wouldn't leave his mind. He wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, some random gossip that had nothing to do with Annika. But the truth was, deep down, he already suspected something was wrong. And once doubt sets in, it doesn't go away. It feeds on every small detail, every vague answer, every averted glance. That night, when he got home, he found Annika getting her bag ready for yet another lesson. He watched her in silence. The perfume, the makeup, the excessive care with her outfit. She looked like she was going on a date, not just giving a German lesson. "You still haven't told me much about your students," he commented, trying to sound casual. She glanced at him quickly but went on arranging her things. "They're just regular people. Business people, students, folks who want to learn German for different reasons. James moved closer. Have you become friends with any of them? She paused for a second, then laughed. Of course not. They're just students. That should have reassured him, but it didn't. The way she avoided eye contact, how she tried to change the subject. It all made him more suspicious. That's when James made a decision he never thought he'd make, hiring a private investigator. The next day, without telling Annika, he met with a professional a coworker had recommended. He was a discreet man, not very talkative, but with sharp eyes that suggested he'd seen it all. What exactly do you want to know? The detective asked. James took a deep breath. He knew that from this point on, there was no turning back. I want to know where my wife goes when she leaves the house. Who she meets. And what really goes on in these private lessons. The detective nodded and asked for basic information about Annika's usual schedule and the places she frequented. He promised he'd have answers in just a few days. James drove home with a heavy heart. Part of him hoped he was wrong, that this was just foolish paranoia or baseless insecurity. But another part already knew the truth. He just needed the evidence. The next few days felt like the longest of his life. Every time Annika left the house, he was restless, anxious, waiting for the detective's call. And finally, it came. I need you to come over. I have something to show you. James felt his heart race. He drove to the detective's office with sweaty palms and a knot in his stomach. When he arrived, there was a plain brown envelope on the desk. The detective slid it toward him without saying a word. With trembling fingers, James opened it and started looking through the photos. What he saw made his world collapse. Annika was in an expensive restaurant, sitting across from a man in a suit. In another photo, she was laughing, her hand on his across the table. More pictures showed them entering a fancy building, a hotel. James closed his eyes. He wanted to believe there was some explanation, that maybe it was all a misunderstanding. But the detective didn't give him any time for denial. This happened more than once, always with different men. Most of them are businessmen. She supposedly teaches German. But from what I've learned, the language isn't the only thing they're paying for. His words felt like a punch in the gut. James felt the floor disappear under his feet. He stood up from the chair, not knowing what to do. If you need more proof, I can keep investigating, the detective offered. James shook his head. No. I've seen enough. He drove home in a daze. What was he going to do? How would he confront Annika? Did he even want to hear her try to explain? He parked outside his house and just sat there, staring at the front door. Everything they'd built together, everything he believed about her, about their marriage, about love, it all turned into a lie. And now, he had to decide what to do with that truth. James stood there in front of the house, struggling with every breath. His fingers trembled. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. He wanted to go inside, but at the same time, he wanted to vanish. As if by delaying that moment, he could avoid the inevitable pain. He took a deep breath and turned the doorknob. The familiar scent of Annika's perfume still lingered in the air. The TV was on in the living room. She was there, as if nothing had happened, as if his life was still the same. Annika was sitting on the couch, distracted, holding a glass of wine. As soon as she saw James, she smiled. "Hey, honey. How was your day?" That question cut him like a knife. How could she act like that? How could she dare smile at him after everything? James walked slowly to the table and threw the envelope onto it. The flat thump of paper made Annika raise an eyebrow. "What's this?" she asked, picking up the envelope without much interest. "Open it." His voice was firm, though inside he was falling apart. Annika opened the envelope, pulled out the photos, and started flipping through them. Her eyes quickly took in the images, one man, then another, the hotel, the meetings. She saw it all. A few seconds of silence passed. James expected a reaction. He expected her to get angry, to try to explain, to break down in tears or beg for forgiveness, anything. But what came next was something he never would have predicted. She let out a bored sigh, put the photos on the table, and took another sip of wine. "So you followed me?" James felt a wave of anger rise in his throat. "I didn't follow you, Annika. I had to hire someone because everything you've been telling me is a lie." She gave a crooked smile and crossed her legs with a calmness that suggested she saw nothing wrong. "What do you want me to say, James?" He stared at her, stunned. "I want the truth. I want to know how long you've been doing this. I want to know what we mean to each other, if anything we had was ever real." Annika tilted her head and studied him for a moment, her gaze strangely cold. "What does it mean to you?" she asked, shrugging. "We had good times, didn't we? Wasn't that enough?" James clenched his fists. "You ruined everything." She let out a low laugh. "James, you act like we took eternal vows, like I was some perfect woman who'd never make a mistake. You were living in a fantasy." Her words were like knives to his chest. "A fantasy? You made me believe we were happy. You moved into my home, shared my life, made plans with me." She took another sip of wine before replying in a calm voice, "And we were happy. For a while. But things change." James felt a lump in his throat. "This was never a real marriage for you, was it?" Annika didn't answer right away. She got up from the couch, walked over to the window, and stood there, looking outside, as if searching for the best way to end this uncomfortable conversation. "I liked you, James. But I was never cut out for this life. I never wanted to be anyone's wife." James rubbed his face with his hands, struggling to process what she was saying. How had he been so blind? How could he not see that it was all fake? "You don't feel anything? Not even regret?" She glanced at him over her shoulder, her eyes void of emotion. "I think it'd be better if you just accepted it." That was the final straw. James felt sick, like he'd been poisoned by everything he'd lived through with her. There was nothing left to say. Nothing left to save. He turned and headed for the door. "What are you going to do now?" Annika asked, sounding indifferent. James paused for a moment and let out a bitter laugh. "I'm leaving." Then, without looking back, he walked out, carrying only the pain of a truth he never wanted to face. James left that house without looking back. The door closed behind him, and with it, part of his life that now felt like a huge mistake. The cold night air hit his face, but it didn't snap him out of the numbness he felt. He stood there on the sidewalk, alone, not just physically, but crushed by disappointment and humiliation, realizing that everything he'd built with Annika had been an illusion. Over the next few days, he did what he had to do. He gathered the documents for the divorce, found a lawyer, and began planning his permanent exit from that life. But no matter how hard he tried to move on, something kept holding him back. Every corner of the house was a cruel reminder of what he'd lost. The smell of Annika's perfume still clung to the sheets, her clothes were still in the closet. Everything felt like a ghost from the life he thought he had but never truly did. James no longer wanted to live surrounded by memories. He needed a fresh start. That's when he made a drastic decision. He requested a transfer at the bank to work in a distant city, where no one knew his story. He was done with pitying looks from co-workers and tired of hearing whispers from people who now knew his wife wasn't just a German teacher, but something else entirely. Because Annika didn't change. On the contrary, after the divorce, she carried on with her special lessons, without any concern about hiding it. James still heard rumors. Some former co-workers mentioned that Annika had become even bolder. She was now flaunting fancy clothes, upscale dinners, and a lifestyle way beyond what a simple language teacher could afford. The most ironic part was she didn't even bother putting on a front anymore. For James, that was confirmation of something he'd known deep down all along: Annika was never the person he thought she was. The love he felt for her was real, but the woman he loved never truly existed. So he packed up what he had into a few suitcases and left. The new city was different. At first, he felt out of place, lost, like he'd left a piece of himself behind. But little by little, he realized it was the best thing he could have done. Without the shadow of the past lurking around every corner, James started rebuilding his life. At work, he threw himself into his job like never before. But it wasn't just about that. He went back to doing things he'd set aside. He began going for runs in the early morning, trying out new restaurants, and taking random walks with no specific destination. On one of these aimless walks, he stumbled upon a small bookstore. He'd never been a big reader, but that day, he picked up a random book and sat down in a cozy armchair. Lost in the pages of a story that wasn't his, he felt his mind settle for the first time since the divorce. Months went by. The scars were still there, but they didn't hurt as much. What once seemed unbearable was now just a distant memory. Then one day, without planning it, he found himself genuinely laughing again. No effort, no pretending, just laughing. That's when he realized something crucial: he hadn't run away. He had saved himself. Because the past can leave its mark, but it can't define who we are. And James still had a whole lot of life ahead of him. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.